a lot of researchers and some policymakers are saying, hey, whether coal transition happens this decade or next decade, just transition needs to start now.
So, hello and welcome to another edition of the Assay Live. Today, I am here with Sandeep Pai, who is Senior Research Lead with the Global Transition Network at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And we are going to be talking about just transition and its implications for the greater community. So, Sandeep, maybe to start off, it would be great if you could explain a little bit about what a just transition entails.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So just transition as a background means very different things to many different people. But broadly, what just transition means is it's justice in transition. In the context of energy transition, when we are talking about moving away from broadly, fossil fuel-based energy systems to renewable energy-based energy systems, we want to make sure that workers, communities, and other members of the society who might be negatively impacted as a result of this transition, we want to make sure that the impacts that they will suffer in terms of, let's say, job losses or, for states and cities, revenue losses are mitigated. And so that broadly is the idea of just transition. But like I said, it means very, very different things to different people. For some, it could mean complete transformation of the world. For others, it's a very narrow focus of certain workers and their jobs and so on. But what I believe in my role and my work, what just transition means is to make sure that the losers of the transition do not suffer. And so therefore, any steps that are required to make sure that there are minimal number of losers in the transition. We know that there will be lots of winners. So just to make sure that there are lesser number of losers.
Okay. And you focus quite a bit on what's been happening in India. Maybe you can share a bit of background about what you see happening there as the country and the greater global economy continue along this path towards full decarbonization. And then maybe more broadly speaking, what are some of the implications that you see for developing countries around the region?
Yeah, so I mean, as a background, India is one of the very unique countries when it comes to the global energy space. Unlike many countries, in the West or the global North countries in general, where energy demand is sort of like peaked or it's flat or it's declining. So what you're thinking about, or what we're thinking about, is replacing certain sources, coal, oil, or gas, with one set of sources. So you're switching something off, and then you're building something else. But in India's case, what's happening is one of the few countries whose energy demand is going to expand going into the future. So when you have a growing energy demand economy, what happens is the country tries to rely on both fossil fuels as well as renewables, because if you want to shut down coal, for example, in India, you have to build even more renewables. So therefore, it's a very unique country in that sense, where because millions of people live in energy poverty, and coal being the only domestic sort of resource, of course, renewables are now there and rising. The share of coal and the share and importance of coal certainly remain. So in that sense, what India's policymakers, investors, companies are focusing on is a policy of promoting renewables aggressively, but at the same time also relying on coal to meet, the bedrock of energy demand in the country. So therefore, the conversation about decarbonization is more about building renewables rather than shutting down coal. Very different from other contexts where the energy demand is flat, where you're actually talking about shutting down something and then building something else. So that's what's happening in terms of energy transition. And with that for background, the just transition debate, because you're not really shutting down anything, big at the moment, although there is lots of shutting down of inefficient power plants and inefficient mines. So at that scale, just transition is quite important. But at a larger scale, just transition debate is still not there yet. However, uh, because coal will not shut down this decade, and it could start to see peak in the early next decade and then decline, that doesn't mean just transition planning does not need to happen, because as we have seen from global cases, just transition is a multi-decade process. It takes a long time to diversify the economy, especially regional state economies. It takes a long time to retrain workers, deploy them in newer industries, to replenish revenues and so. So therefore, a lot of us, a lot of researchers and some policymakers are saying, hey, whether coal transition happens this decade or next decade, just transition needs to start now. So that's what's broadly happening in India.
You talked a little, you just brought up kind of the what policymakers are doing. I'm not sure, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the role of policymakers, and maybe examples that you've seen kind of in helping to ensure a just transition.
Yeah, so I mean, these are again, like very early stages of just transition discourse, dialogue, or policy making in India. But we see Ministry of Coal working with World Bank to create policies regarding environmental remediation of coal infrastructure. What that means is, there's lots of coal mines that shut down because of various reasons. There are legacy mines that have historically been mined out, but there were no rules to clean up that mine, and so they are lying abandoned. And then there are mines that are currently under operation. So Ministry of Coal is working with World Bank to create social and equitable environmental remediation policies and guidelines, so that when you shut down those mines, you not only shut down and clean up the infrastructure, but you also make sure that you create short-term local jobs for communities who might have lost jobs. So that's one example. There's something called District Mineral Foundation in India, which is basically, it's kind of like a severance tax for local districts, who are basically seeing mining in their jurisdictions. And so this tax is a really good example or way in which local communities can invest in job skilling, job creation, livelihood creation, and so on. So therefore, like, it's more, here and there, certain things are happening. It's not a full-fledged just transition sort of like policy push. The way just transition policy push happens in other countries which have taken up the topic in a much broader ways, they create legislations around these topics. So you can see Canada now rolling out, they're trying to create a just transition act. So many subnational jurisdictions in US like Colorado and New Mexico have legal just transition legislations. Even South Africa has a presidential commission on just transition. India has not reached that stage. It's still much like initiative by some ministries, initiative by some individuals, etc. But that's because India's coal sector is not seeing any decline yet. Once that decline happens, or even a sense of decline happens, I think you will see a lot of more explicit just transition policies in the country.
You've talked quite a bit about kind of the implications on jobs and retraining. Are there other kind of broader social or cultural impacts that come with the move away from coal?
Yeah, so I mean, many people think, oh, they often, you can see in the news media, they always compare job numbers between coal and renewables. I think that's not very useful. I mean, I also did some of those analysis in my past work, but they are useful to the extent that it explains one part of the coal ecosystem. So coal, if you think about coal mining, right, it's a 50, 70-year-old occupation, it's an industry. And so it's an ecosystem. What I mean by that, it creates jobs, direct, indirect, induced jobs. It basically, in some of these coal mining areas, there's nothing else. It's just the coal. It's a mono industry. It provides local revenues. It provides state revenues, in India's case, Indian railways really rely on coal transportation because they overcharge coal transportation and subsidize the passenger segment. There's 500,000 coal pensioners in India who rely on continuation of the coal industry. So there's a lot of cultural significance. People are second, third, fourth generation coal miners. There are lots of villages around coal mining areas that scavenge and collect coal and use it for household cooking purposes, and so on and so forth. And this kind of ecosystem is not only in India, but the elements of the ecosystem may be different, but you can see this kind of ecosystem in every country, be it an advanced economy, be it South Africa, be it Indonesia, be it India. And so therefore, just a jobs to job comparison is not appropriate. I think what we need is a systematic, holistic planning of how to make sure that the elements of the ecosystem are addressed.
Okay, very interesting. And because we talk a lot with junior miners, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about kind of the role that mining companies can take to help with this just transition idea.
Yeah, I mean, despite many people, villainize mining companies, I actually believe in this context, in the context of just transition, they have an outsized role, especially when we talk about countries like, and let me give you a few examples: India, South Africa, to some degree, Indonesia. The reason being is that the mining ecosystem is dominated by state-owned companies who not only have a coal production mandate, but they also have a welfare mandate. Some of these places in India, for example, when you visit, you will see these, because this is a state-owned company, they spend a lot of money on housing, they spend a lot of money on education, health. And okay, one thing before I praise these companies, I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of health and environmental impacts beyond climate impacts that happens because of coal mining, and there's no question that coal transition is the need of the hour. But having said that, because these state-owned companies have a welfare mandate, they are really dominant players in the ecosystem. In some cases, what happens is the state government or the provincial government stops funding or executing developmental projects because they have these large mining companies that actually take on that role. So if you think about Coal India in India or Eskom in South Africa, these companies have really outsized role in ensuring transition. And the way they can do it is they can diversify their business, move away from coal, but they should do it in places where currently mining is happening, not in some other parts of the country. And so that's going to be really important. If in India's case, if Coal India, the state-owned monopoly, can diversify its business, be it solar, be it like any solar manufacturing, be it completely different sectors, be it hydrogen, and if they can diversify locally so that they can retain some of those jobs that might be lost otherwise.
Okay, interesting. And finally, wondering if there's any just kind of standout examples that you've come across of either companies or governments kind of maybe not a success, because it's not an end kind of goal, but have successfully implemented these types of ideas.
Yeah, I think there's an arc of just transition and just transition, where certain countries are really advanced in their thinking. They have legislation. So example would be Germany. Examples would be like, some of the other European countries. And some US states like Colorado would fall in that example. They have legislations, they have set aside lots of sums of money. Companies, governments, local governments, they're all part of this coalition. They have policies targeted at individual workers to help them. They have policies targeted at communities to help them. They have policies targeted at attracting investments. So this would be like the advanced just transition countries. The second would be countries that have woken up to the idea of just transition. They haven't implemented anything as such, but they are serious. They have formed Just Transition Task Force, which are cross-cutting between policymakers, companies, individuals, unions. That one example of that would be South Africa. Really lots happening, especially after COP. Lots of people are interested. Prime President has created a Just Transition Commission, etc. And then there are India, which is where just transition is like a 1 or 2 year old topic, where people are just becoming aware about the topic and its implications. There are some broader policies such as environmental remediation, etc., which they could or could not be part of just transition, but that's the third category where India is, where it's a new topic. It's growing, and the understanding around the topic is also growing.
And that finally, what are some kind of ways to, I suppose, highlight the need for a just transition, or highlight kind of these types of ideas, both to kind of mining companies, to governments, to investors?
Yeah, what I think is, so in the country one category, like the advanced just, I don't think we need to highlight much, because the government is behind what's happening. So, but in the second and the third, I think, especially at a local level, especially at companies that are operating, the contractors, the coal contractors and others, I think people are not aware about what just transition means, what are its implications, what's the coal ecosystem. Like, people are not seeing the big picture. So I think ways to do this is through media. I think media can write, both national and regional media in different countries can write stories and articles about that. The second would be to host conferences and workshops with key sectoral stakeholders. That is why we have launched this Just Transition Network, Global Just Transition Network, where we will have closed door workshops with coal industry folks, unions, coal dependent states, etc. And on selected themes like how to finance a just transition, how to diversify local economies, how do you responsibly shut down coal mines, what are the different industries that can come up in areas currently relied on coal. So I think workshops, media, reporting, and generally like engaging with policymakers and companies over time, I would be really important first step.
Absolutely. Okay, certainly a lot to think about and a lot to kind of be highlighting as we move forward with all of our events and our webinars and interviews such as this. So Sandeep, I really want to thank you for being with us here today. That was really enlightening. So thank you. And
thank you.